welcome everybody on Facebook and the Dope Black Thoughts family. Thank you for showing up for this live interview with the candidate. We have Steve House, Republican candidate for CD6 in Colorado. And quite frankly, Steve, I want to say thank you for coming into what could easily be a lion's den. It's not, but thank you for being willing to come and talk to people in another party.
I have a little experience with the lion's den. I go to Kenya every year and I go on safari to the Serengeti, and I really like watching the lions, so maybe I'm okay with that.
Fair enough.
Touche. So I'm Kevin Cox.
And I'm Marcus Ivy, and welcome to kind of a special edition of Dope Black Thoughts. And as Kevin stated, we have kind of our conversations with the candidates at this stage. So I'm excited to have Steve House on, Republican candidate for CD6. So welcome.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here, guys.
And, you know, I want to say hats off again because, you know, we reached out to so many people and I didn't expect to see so many people from other parties reach back in and say that they're going to come on and be willing to talk to us. So this is the first in a series of candidate interviews, and we have tons of Democrats that are already lined up. But once again, anybody and everybody out there, follow this example. If you're a candidate of another party, we're welcoming you to come onto the show and talk to us about your platform, because we're all about ideas, and we want to hear what you have to say about it.
And that's exactly correct, Steve. So I do want to say thank you for that. We need to get back to that time when there was civility in discussions and the ability to talk about issues. Whether you agree or disagree, you can have just cordial conversations. So I'm excited.
You know, guys, there's an organization that I'm a part of that I would encourage people to take a look at as well, which is called Braver Angels. And essentially what they do is they put an equal number of Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliateds in a room, and they have a process dialogue on issues. And it works out really well. I don't think that Republicans should be afraid of being on your show, or you should be afraid of being on a more conservative talk show. If we don't start having those kind of discussions with each other, we're just going to fight and get nothing done. And that's why I'm even running in the first place. I want to get something done.
Exactly. All right. So go ahead, Kevin. Get us started. Kick us off.
Okay, look, Steve, we had a love fest, but I can't come to this interview as anything less than a Black man. And in the recent news, I'm sure you've heard all over the media, there's been no charges in the Breonna Taylor murder. And simultaneously, George Brockler, our DA in JD 18, was announcing that there was no charges to be filed against the people that ran their vehicle through the protest. Now, I'm not necessarily a fan of blocking the highway, but I'm also not a fan of people running people over or driving through crowds at high rates of speed. I guess my bold question is, do Black lives matter?
Yes, of course.
Thank you for that. Thank you for a straight answer, which is so much better than so many other people.
I think I was surprised. Because, you know, you hear folks who will beat around the bush before they get there. And, you know, I think it's important to say, yeah, there's an organization, Black Lives Matter, but there's also Black lives. And I think it's important. So, number one, thank you for kind of giving us a straight answer on that aspect. So what's your thought on this, you know, with respect to the charges? I know none of us were in the grand jury room during those discussions and deliberations. The grand jury in Louisville is much like it is here in Colorado. They are considered secret, and they take place behind closed doors. But what are your thoughts on that from what you've seen?
You know, I don't know the case very well, but what I do know is a no-knock raid. I think it was for a suspicion of drugs. A gunshot happens, and then a bunch of gunshots happen, and Breonna Taylor ends up dead. It's tragic. I think if you go through those kind of things and no one is held responsible, that makes the tragedy even worse. I don't know the range of potential charges that could be played in this case, but the one thing I do know, if nothing changes, it's even more horrible, guys. I mean, we can't have this thing happening like this. And I know that at least what I heard was a young man fired a gun at the police. You know, if someone knocks down my door, you know, no knock raids my house, I would probably fire a gun too. I mean, come on. You know, it's a very difficult scenario. I think there has to be Somebody has to look at how it was approached, was it done right? And there has to be some way of dealing with culpability in this case.
You know, part of it is the culture of giving people's character an autopsy after they've been killed and
Right.
saying that there were suspicion of this, they may have dealt drugs. But the bottom line is his Second Amendment rights were completely trampled upon because when he protected his abode, people were killed in his house. You know, someone kicks in your door, you should protect your family. I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of guns, but at the same time, I own a gun, right? So we all understand that there's a deadly consequence when you fire a gun. But we have that right. We should not be gunned down for protecting our household.
Yeah, you know, would it have been a better strategy for the police to, instead of doing a no-knock raid, I mean, that's one of the big challenges with no-knock raids, right? Do you have the right to defend yourself on the inside of your house if someone breaks the door down and you don't know why they're coming? And that's clearly one of the problems with this case and the situation is, you know, I'd like to see somebody relook at no-knock raids to begin with. I understand from the police perspective that there are situations that are dangerous like that, but maybe it's not entry into the house. Maybe it is, you know, you push the door open and let people know you're coming in. But I just don't think this is going to end up this way. I think there's something more that has to be done in this case.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree with you more. But definitely from the point of view of a defense attorney, criminal defense attorney, I agree. No-knock raids are not good. For me, yes, I own guns too. And so I know for many that may be a shock, but you know, I believe in the ability to bear arms, and I believe in the ability to protect your house. I got 3 kids, a wife, 2 dogs, and those things are important to me. So I know that probably differs with many, but let's talk real briefly, if we could. What is your feeling on the Second Amendment?
You know, I think that the people should be given an opportunity to vote to change the Second Amendment if they want it changed. The bigger issue for me is if you look deeply into what happens in violence, in most cases where there's violence, there's a mental health issue at hand. We haven't made mental health resources available. Clearly, we got to do a better job on background check stuff. One of the things about our background check systems is the data is not complete. There's some issues that need to be resolved. I think for the Second Amendment, I think Congress or states need to offer the people an option to choose what they want. And I think if the people choose something different, we'll have something different. But either way, if you took all the guns away, like a gun-free zone like Chicago, and you do nothing about mental health, we're still going to have problems. We've got to get mental health addressed as part of the equation.
And so when you say mental health, and this is not a facetious question, define to me what your idea of mental health is. What do you see when you say we got to deal with mental health?
If you're an individual and you're going to pick up a pair of handguns and 500 rounds of ammo, and you're going to walk into Virginia Tech and you're going to start shooting people dead, taking a life is something that is not mentally right. I mean, most people would feel a sense of remorse. If you look at most of the mass shootings, I mean, virtually all, the FBI says that there was some mental health issue at play. A lot of them, there was a known problem with the shooter and nobody acted. Those are a lot of those cases you need mental health support. I don't think taking away guns would solve the problem in and of itself. So that's why I think you got to address the mental health problem along the way.
Okay.
And we also know that historically, it would be enforced more heavily and disproportionately against people of color. If there's a law saying that we're going to take certain weapons, we know that immediately Black people's guns will be taken. And I don't like the idea of saying we can't do gun control because Black people got to have guns. But I do like the idea of saying we need common sense gun legislation.
Correct. And you know what? I don't think we've debated it nearly enough either. I mean, I think we've sort of shut down the discussions when we get to a legislative body, one way or the other. We shut it down and we don't have a discussion. We say, okay, so what's really happening? And 60% of shootings, of 60% of all mass shootings, handguns are used, not long guns. Long guns are only used on their own 10% of the time. So is the AR-15 really the target, or is it something else? Right? Is it the ammunition? Is it the size of the magazines? There's a lot of different issues that come up. I think we take what's politically convenient and we say, well, let's get rid of long guns or assault rifles, and that should fix things. Well, you know what? 6 months later, when it hasn't fixed things, we're going to go back to the same discussion about mental health issues and how we get people to stop believing it's okay to shoot your neighbor.
Okay. So let me segue into another question. And kind of into another area. So you're running for office, and you're running for CD6,
Right.
which is where we all live. So one question that's been pushed out, that's been submitted to Joe Biden, that's been submitted to Donald Trump, that's been submitted to all candidates is, do you have a platform for the Black community? Do you have some stances, some positions for the Black community that seek to address the concerns of the Black community? And as you can see, over the past 3 years, there's been many, actually probably longer than that, but really over the past 3 years, it's intensified. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, let's define the problem first. So today, as it stands, the average Black family has a net wealth of $19,100. The average white and Asian family, it's $171,000. That didn't happen overnight. It isn't just, and it was caused by a series of major decisions made that were racist in nature from the time of Ghana and the first deportations against their will of Black slaves until we got through the Civil War and the Homestead Act and all these things that have come into play. You know, the GI Bill, all of these things came into play, and it's put us into the situation we're in. On top of that, you have to add the fact that education has not done the right thing for the Black community. We've had way too many people graduating high school, not proficient in literacy, not proficient in math. You have to make adjustments to how you do things. So let's start with the premise that there's a major injustice. Most of the injustice from an economic point of view centers at least on its basis around home ownership. So I think we got to take a look at home ownership. We got to take a look at how that works. 440,000 small businesses that were owned by Black people died during COVID. It was 41% of the entire small business ownership component for Black entrepreneurs. There needs to be a restart program. And the restart program focuses on the idea that businesses are successful when they have enough capital and they have experience. The experience is already there. These people were running businesses. The capital went away because they were undercapitalized when they started, which is often the case if you don't own a home or you have, a problem with how much your total net wealth is or net worth is. You don't have enough capital to put your business into play and not struggle on a day-to-day, week-by-week basis to pay payroll and things like that. So we've got to restructure how we approach the restart programs we need to do specifically in Black-owned businesses. And then we got to look at how we deal with home ownership, because home ownership over decades provides a family legacy of wealth development. We have something we call the Build Black Wealth Plan, which addresses a couple of these things. We're about ready to release it. We haven't done it yet, but essentially saying, look, inequality between men and women in payroll is one thing, but this level of inequality, 10 times net worth differences between the average Black family and the average white family, no one can tell me that that's just, because it's not.
I'm actually excited to hear about the plan, quite frankly.
Absolutely. And keep us posted about that. We're going to be hearing about a lot of plans a lot of people have. And I want to talk about what's your background? Why do you feel like you're qualified to be our congressman here in CD6?
I think it goes to several components. There's the where did I come from? I went to college. I was raised on a small farm. We were I was low middle class at the highest level. I understand how to work through that. I had a birth defect. I suffered through, lots of healthcare problems and situations. I then became the first kid in my family to go to college, and I ended up becoming a biomedical engineer. So my career's been in healthcare. I've run my own businesses. I've been involved in running large businesses in America. I know what it's like to struggle. I know what it's like to do a startup. I've got a great family. So that's one aspect of it. But on the other side of it is service itself. So I sit on the Salvation Army board. I sit on the Braver Angels board. I have my own nonprofit based in Kenya called Hope for Kenya, which helps put kids back in school and educate them. I work with Almost Home in the community here, Boys and Girls Club. I think if you're going to be a congressman representing a district, you have to have some perspective on what service is about. That helps you answer the phone. It helps you understand when people are struggling. When I get someone calling me, and this happened yesterday, saying, look, my wedding planning business is going out of business. I don't know what to do. Can you help? And, having gone through struggles in business and understanding how things work, I can point her in the right direction. And we did that. We've helped a number of people Black, white, Asian, Hispanic entrepreneurs get contacted by the SBA, help them to solve problems. I think when you've run your own business, you know how to solve problems, especially when they get very, very challenging. And I think that's what makes me qualified. And lastly, I'm a very action-oriented guy. We will put policy on the table in the House on healthcare, on education, on immigration, and on racial justice in the first 90 days when we get into Congress.
So you have plans for those things in those first 90 days.
Yep, we do.
Where can people find those plans? Are they written down?
I can actually send them to them. We have some highlights on our website, but right now we're going to start to publish those as we get into the voting period. So you'll see more about them. The healthcare plan is an op-ed on it. And virtually all of them we're writing op-eds that will be published in newspapers so people can have access to exactly what the policy looks like.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about economic justice. One other thing that's very important, especially people of color, is environmental justice.
Right.
What's your thoughts? I mean, there's all types of questions we can ask, but I don't want to lead. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts on
environmental justice?
Okay, so let's make it easy. Do you believe that climate change is real and caused by human beings?
I absolutely believe it's real because we see the data, right? I'm a data guy from the beginning. I'm not sure how much of the change is caused by mankind, but I don't think that changes what we should do. I think what we should do isn't really dependent upon whether you agree it's mankind or not. I mean, there are some very specific steps that need to be taken. We should clean up the 8.5 million tons of plastic in waterways. That'll stop CO2 emission. We need to stop burning coal in coal plants and use natural gas. We've already seen a dramatic change in CO2 emission from that. We need to change from biomass like trees and wood and other things being burned in other countries that create massive problems with air quality and CO2 emission. Ethiopia is a great example. They're putting in a hydropower dam. The U.S. should support them in that. It will stop them from burning wood for heating and cooking. It will also allow them to plant billions of trees, create an evaporating water environment, and they will grow things unlike they've ever done before. There's CO2 mineralization. It's a new innovative technology that allows you to capture CO2 out of the air, embed it back in cement. Why is it important in cement? Cement produces 8.4% of the CO2 that we produce on an annual basis in the world. If you take the CO2 out of the air, you can reduce it by that amount. Once we do those types of things, and we start to see the CO2, which runs somewhere in the 415 parts per million, if we drop it down to in the 350 range, we'll know whether it's effective or not. And at that point, I think then we could take some more significant steps. But I think all those steps are doable in the short run. Being able to convert from natural gas and oil to all solar, all wind, I don't think we're ready for that. But the other thing I think we ought to do, and we should have done it in Colorado, is we said, we want 20% of our energy to be from alternative energy sources in this state. I think it should have been mandated at or below the price of natural gas to give the innovators a bigger challenge on not forcing, moms in 5 Points to pay 3 times as high of an electric bill. I don't think that's going to be workable.
So you are for the reduction in burning of fossil fuels, things of that nature.
Yeah, anything because it's not just fossil fuels. Anything that contributes to a reduction in CO2 emissions, I think, is a good thing. I've read the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It does not forecast man's extinction like AOC says. She's wrong about that. What it does say is, what happens to our planet if we have a 4 degrees Celsius increase in temperature between now and 2050? Sea levels rise 2.7 or 2 feet 7 inches. Will we wait until the end of 2049 before we start addressing sea levels? No, but there are some really specific things we should do about CO2 emission now, because if we're wrong, if the side of the fence says, oh, it's not man-made, it's something else. If we're wrong about that, it's going to be pretty late in the game before we figure that out. And I think there's some really good things we can do right now.
Okay.
So the environmental justice piece of this is the phenomenon of, just like racial justice, people in Black and brown communities tend to have more polluting facilities nearby. So like if you go to Suncor, there's not going to be a rich white neighborhood downwind from Suncor. So when they have an emissions event, which is what they love to call it, like gases that are carcinogens and toxic floating through your neighborhood. When they have an emissions event, it's not going to happen to white folks. It's not going to happen to the people that are well off. It's going to happen to the poorest amongst us. Have you made any plans to kind of try to mitigate that?
Absolutely. One of the things we look at when we look at how to age better and how our healthcare, overall health status is, right? I mean, COVID disproportionately affected the Black and brown communities in a lot of respects because the health status in those communities wasn't what it needed to be. It's some part immunity, but if you're living in a polluted area and the air quality is not very good, and those are the exact situations you're describing, your health status, your immunity levels are going to be lower. Everything that happens to you is going to affect you. We need to specifically look at pollution, not just oil and gas production, but there's plenty of areas where there are garbage dumps. You look at the city of Baltimore, right? That's not here, but in the city of Baltimore, there are garbage dumps all over that city that are very close to residential areas. And they're not really garbage dumps. They're just places where people are stacking garbage. You can't let that be the case and have a good health policy, and we need to fix that.
Sure. All right. So once again, and I keep asking, these things, you have kind of plans that you're prepared to put out and discuss.
Yep.
Okay.
By the way, let's go back to Kevin's question for one more comment, right? We measure, as you probably know, we measure radon, right? Because radon is a gas that, can do brain damage and all kinds of good things. I think we have to look at what are the things we need to measure in a neighborhood that determine whether the healthiness of that neighborhood based on what's around it is achieving a certain threshold. And I think we don't do that. Radon's one thing, but there's a lot of other things that go on, in a neighborhood, chemicals in the air, other things that we need to do. We need to establish a threshold for what is a healthy neighborhood and make sure that we're taking care of it that way.
So let me ask you this question. Do you think, particularly in Aurora, if you look out east of 470, there is a massive amount of construction going on.
Right.
Do you think there's too much construction going on, which is, of course, causing more chemicals in our ground, more chemicals in the air? What are your thoughts on that?
In that particular case, there's a lot of dust in the air and things like that. The good news is there's not a lot of population out there yet. The balance you've got to have is okay, so I want affordable housing. We now know right now that affordable housing means anything under $500,000 for a house.
Yes.
In Colorado, the average home price is now $504,000. That they're building is 2,100 square feet. It's $235 per square feet, and there's no way to solve that problem right now. So on one hand, we need to build a lot more housing so that we have more availability in the supply side. Yes. Are there rules that can be used to make sure the water, the air, and things are clean while they're doing construction? Yes, some of that's in play. But, we'll look at it. We'll look at suggestions for people to give us on that in that regard.
Okay. So
I was going to talk about affordable housing real quick.
yeah, well, go ahead. Yeah, because I was
That's a major talking point for anybody coming into Aurora or the greater area around Aurora. Is affordable housing. Our average income is not keeping up with the cost of living. And so many people are having to pile up on each other in these houses. No one's going around without at least a consideration of renting out their basement. Some of them are renting 2 or 3 rooms out of their house so they can survive with a totally different lifestyle than what we would consider to be the American dream, right? You never really thought about, I'm going to grow up and get a job and have 2.5 kids and a dog named Spot, and I'm going to rent the basement to Mike and James, right? No one thought about that.
No.
Do you have some sort of a plan? What's your plan for affordable housing?
You have to look at what costs there are in housing and what demand there is. Every state's different. I think it's more of a state issue than a federal issue. I think you either have to do one of two things, Kevin. You either have to raise the average income to be able to afford the more expensive house, or you've got to lower the cost of the house. Water certificates, for example, when you build a house in Colorado, can be as much as $30,000. That adds $30,000 to the cost of a house. It's $30,000 whether that house is a $200,000 house, or it's $30,000 whether that's a $500,000 house. It's true that we build massive houses and then we regulate the daylights out of what happens when we build that house. The fact that we can't really build condos anymore because of construction defects laws, there were unintended consequences associated with some of those laws that have made it a regulatory problem and people don't build those condos. The way it was supposed to work, the way you're talking about, a dog, two kids, a house, a white picket fence, in real terms in America, people were supposed to rent, then buy a condo, sell the condo after they've developed some equity, then buy a small home, and then move up and up and up. And that's how you build the net worth that you need to build over time. Well, we've skipped a step in the condos. We now just have rental and rents rising, and then we have large homes. I think we got to go back and look at that interim step. In my area where I live, there are small houses being built to lease. And they're not tiny homes. They're a little bit bigger than tiny homes, but not much. But one of the ways they're addressing the problem of affordable housing is they're building these small houses very close together on small lots to create a housing option. It's just getting started. I think it's a really good idea because you distribute the cost of the water certificate and the regulatory environment over more homes than just one, and you can lower the price. We need to do both things. We need to develop economic plans so people can make more money, build their own wealth, and be able to move through a chain from rental to ownership up until they get to the house that they dreamed about. And we haven't done a very effective job until we get rid of this construction defects problem and start to see more options available in the housing market.
Well, and that leads me definitely with respect to affordable housing and the economic plan. Obviously, we're both on the school board. We have teachers who don't make a lot of money.
Right.
Aurora has seemingly become a place where, in order to rent a single bedroom, costs you $1,300. So, how do we bring programs like that? Do you have a plan to bring programs like that where you got these small houses where you can spread out, if you will, the cost of the water table, electricity grid, whatever in that aspect? Do you have a plan, or is that something that we can do here in Aurora, at least in this area?
Oh, I think you could do it. I mean, where it's done, I've seen it done is in Brighton, and they've done a great job. There's one development, it's early on in the process. Going back to teachers for a minute though, Marcus, and that's, I saw the Aurora City Council suggest that there was going to be $1 million housing fund for teachers in Aurora. Now, look, if I was a teacher, you guys are both on the school board. If I was a teacher, I'd look at you guys and say, don't give me a housing subsidy, pay me enough to buy a house, right? Pay me enough money to buy a house. I think we have to look at how much we pay teachers because, first of all, we need to attract more teachers. We need to attract teachers who have a longer term, better perspective on what they want to do in education. We're going to create flexibility in education that's going to demand that teachers are more innovative and creative. But we got to pay them enough to actually live in the district. And that's a serious problem in Aurora right now. And living in the district doesn't mean that you live, east of the Aurora Reservoir and have to drive 45 minutes to get to a school. If you want to do that, great. But right now, we need to have a serious discussion in Aurora at the school board level, at the city level, at the developer level. I'm having a meeting with a bunch of developers next Wednesday night, and one of the questions I'm going to ask them is about these small home, densely packed housing developments, lease option buy. When can we get some more of those in Aurora and in the district? It's great they're in Brighton. They're better than an apartment because you live by yourself in a house. They're usually 1 or 2 bedrooms with a small kitchen and a living room. If that's where you go and then you move up from there to a better house because housing prices rise, that's wonderful. But there is not a step function you can do right now because we're missing those small home options, those lower price home options on the condominiums.
What it sounds like to me you're talking about is just an entry path to home ownership.
Yeah, I mean, you need a path, right? You either have to wait until you have enough money to put a down payment down large enough to drop your monthly mortgage payment and your tax payment to be able to afford that house. And quite frankly, if 1 bedroom is $1,300 a month, it's pretty hard to save money.
Virtually impossible if you're not living in debt and making no money that you don't actually have.
And that money is going into the, no offense, it's going into the pocket of the landlord and not going into the pocket of the renter so that they can build that equity and that wealth, which is a major issue. And you're right, $500,000 has become affordable for some. I'll never forget City Councilwoman Angela Lawson had talked about how she was single and looking at the cost of a house was like $350,000, which was not reasonable. And we're still there. In fact, they're only getting worse. I'm looking out at the communities by me, and the cost of a house is $475,000 to $520,000. And I don't know how people are affording it. The other aspect of it is HOAs don't allow you to rent out your property per se,
Right.
which is another issue. So how can you bring down the cost, especially if you were in a crisis as we're currently in, where you don't have the finances yourself? So those are the other issues.
I think that there's an option that should be looked at. You know, we used to do things called land contracts, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So you buy the house,
Yep.
but you don't own the land initially, right? You know, there's some period of time in which you can buy the land that your house is sitting on. You know, people are willing to do that in some cases because it makes financial sense with how the value of real estate changes. I think we need to look at different models. We need to look at the model of the small house, but maybe we should be looking at doing land contract types developments so that, you know, you can get a house, but you can't quite afford the extra $200,000 for the lot or $150,000 for the lot, and then move you forward as time goes on and let you pay that down. If you're starting out, if you're Angela and you're making, you know, let's say, for example, let's do round numbers, right? So you're making $96,000 a year, that's $8,000 a month. You know, if you take your after-tax amount and make that somewhere around $4,800, and you can pay no more than about 38% or 40% of that, you know, now all of a sudden your maximum payment you can make for your house is $2,000. Oh my gosh, you know what kind of house you can afford for $2,000 a month? It isn't all that great unless you have a down payment of a reasonable amount.
Right.
Because a $500,000 house, you know, your monthly payment on that's going to be $3,000 with insurance and taxes. And you already said that unless you're making over $100,000 a year, you're not going to be able to get into it.
All right.
I want to take you back to education because you mentioned flexibility in education. I wouldn't be a school board member, wouldn't be in this community if I didn't ask you, where do you stand on the charter versus traditional school conversation?
So first of all, you guys know as well as I do that charter schools are about that much better in terms of performance than public schools are. But there's a bigger issue at play. The bigger issue for me is that while school choice offers some options and some good ideas, the problem is 90% of the students are still going to a public school. So if you put people into a school choice program and you say, look, I'm for school choice, that's going to solve the educational problem. I'm telling you right now, it's going to take 50 years, and the 90% of the students that are not in a school choice option are not going to gain anything. So while I'd say, you know what, let school choice be school choice, the real problem is, how do you make the 90% of the people that go to public schools effective? What do we need in that public school to make those public schools make people literate, make them proficient in math? I think we've talked about this, Kevin. If you're not proficient in math when you graduate high school, there's 247 professions you can no longer pursue. And that's just wrong, right? If you have a dream, right? If you're not proficient in literacy, it's far worse than that. So I say, rather than the battle being between charter and school choice and public schools, you know, set aside the argument on school choice for a minute. How do we fix the 90% of the students and the environments they're in public schools, and let's pursue that?
And see, we got kind of called out as being wishy-washy about charter schools from time to time, because some of my favorite schools in our district are charter schools. My problem is that the idea of a charter is it's supposed to be a laboratory for new methods, new curriculum, new styles that can improve education. And whenever you find out one that works, you're supposed to roll that out to the masses so that you can help the 90% of the students that aren't benefiting from that yet.
Right.
The issue has been historically that the rubber has never met the road. We see certain models in certain other schools independently run, and we're not saying, okay, now you have a 3-year plan to become a member of the school district. And by the way, that model looks really good, and we're going to roll that out to 10 other schools in the district.
Yeah, I know. And if you think about it, have you seen any studies about what the average student is like going into a charter school from a literacy and proficiency perspective? If you're already high levels of literacy going into a charter school, what you really need to do is manage the student to get through it, get the most out of it. And it's not about whether or not they pass, you know, all 4 sections of the ACT. It's do they get 32 or 35, right? So that you're pushing them up to a higher level to go into a greater college. Does that ever translate itself back to the average public school where you said, you know what, we learned that 22 people in a classroom taught by 3 teachers simultaneously gives a lot better outcome than if you have 1 teacher with 30 students. And so therefore you need to restructure your system so that you have 3 teachers and no more than 20 students in a classroom. That stuff's not getting pushed back from what I can tell. You know, my wife was on the school board as well. And we just saw people fighting the everyday battle with the same sort of systemic problems we've had in schools forever. And I just don't know how charters are helping us solve that mainstream problem right now.
Well, I think my issue is that I don't even know if it's an issue so much is that public schools operate on this foundation of it's quantity. There's more students in the public school, if you will, traditional public school versus your charter school. The charter school operates usually with less students. And so they have that ability, if you will, to give more attention versus the larger school. And what I always say is that, sure, if we had the ability to create more classrooms with more teachers and smaller class sizes, there really it'd be indistinguishable, if you will, between a charter school and a traditional public school in that aspect. But honestly, I don't know how we get there because our financing of our schools are based, in my opinion, on somewhat of an archaic financing situation where we rely on the state to make up the portion that we can't make up from our property taxes. So what are your thoughts on the financing of schools, which in turns helps us pay teachers, helps us build schools that are not 50 years old, helps us get equipment into the schools? What's your thoughts on that?
Let's go back to the charter school for one other thing before I answer that question, Marcus, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And that is, I think if you think about it, in the average charter school, the parents are far more invested in their students or their children's education than it is in a lot of public schools. That's how they ended up pushing them to a charter school, because they have this big investment in their children. It doesn't mean parents that are single moms don't have an investment in their children. I think they do, but they may not have the resources, the time, or the ability to move their child to a charter school. So there's some other problems with that whole equation. Funding wise, you know, I'm a business guy, right? So I say, what's the cost of someone not graduating high school? The data tells us that that person takes $240,000 out of the Treasury in their lifetime. Well, what if they do graduate from high school? They do graduate from high school, they put a minimum of $80-some thousand into the Treasury. The difference between those two numbers is $320,000. So every time a student doesn't graduate, the society that they live in, it costs them, it's an intended or a long-term liability of $320,000. So if you have $320,000 liability for someone who doesn't graduate, it's not reasonably proficient, how much would you spend on education to solve that problem? I think you'd spend a lot more than you do. The question is, I think for funding is that we've tended to tend toward the idea that we just have to pay more to do exactly what we're doing. And I think Kevin and I have had a conversation about, you know, innovation centers, for example. I think we need to look at a model change that says, all right, what if you have a kindergartner with a 400-word vocabulary? How far will that child go in high school? They probably won't make it all the way through. We know that because we have a lot of experience with that. So maybe the business model should be that I'm going to have a separate building, an innovation center, and you are going to stay there until 5th grade if necessary to bring your literacy to a level that it needs to be for you to be successful. Models don't support that. Funding doesn't support that. We need to look at, define, diagnose, and rebuild how schools work so students are successful.
Right. And part of that conversation with the innovation centers was to bring equity back to the district. So I was bringing that up because the Blueprint APS process was just in the front of my mind, our most recent meeting. And we want to make sure we're not baking inequities into the cake. We're trying to make it so that the communities that are the most interested, of course, they were interested in STEM, right? The most lucrative careers are in STEM. We don't want someone to say, hey, my school needs resources over here. So if my student needs or wants to go to STEM and is able to go to STEM courses and is interested in STEM, then let's put them on a bus and ship them across town every single day. I want to figure out a way that we can be more equitable. But with the budget that we have, based on our per pupil funding, our formula does not allow us to have that funding. Here's my question. How can you lead a sea change in how we change and modify how we prioritize education as a society?
You know, the great news about being a congressman is you're one of 435 people who people listen to. I think you have to go out and fight for it. You have to stand in the communities and say, go to the school board meetings. Guess what happens when a congressman shows up at a school board meeting, right? People stand and listen, and you say, look, this is unacceptable. Parents, get up, get mad, march to the school door, do what you have to do to make this happen, because it's just not acceptable the way it is. I mean, our children right now during the coronavirus, I'm really worried about losing 6 months, 8 months, 10 months of an education. And there are different places kids are between, you know, the second grader, the fifth grader, the ninth grader, the 10th grader, 11th grader. You know, the effect of this is going to be pretty dramatic. I think we have to put every option on the table on how we fix education, because we're not competing. We're not competing with India. We're not competing with schools around the world. And we have to do something different.
Yeah, exactly. And you hit it right on the head. And I know that Kevin wanted to talk about Tabor and so forth, which takes me back to that question. Our system is archaic for funding schools. Do you have ideas? And I know that you're looking at joining Congress at the federal level. So how does the federal government help the states change our funding process? What would you suggest in that aspect?
I think the federal government right now spends about 8% or provides about 8% of the school budgets in most of America. A, it could go up a little bit, and B, it could be used for some specific targeted things that the schools themselves need. So maybe it is an innovation center. Maybe there are grant programs that go beyond what that 8% is to say, look, Kevin and Marcus came to us. They showed us the fact that they could take not just graduation rates. You could take 50 students out of Aurora Public Schools if we had the right technology, the right environment, and you could put them in the absolutely superior category of educated students who can then have a pathway to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Amherst, or some other Ivy League school. If that's what you can do versus saying, our objective is to graduate 75, 80% of our students who are on par with math, science, STEM proficiencies. Look, guys, I think you could literally make a pitch, and I think Congress ought to hear you. I'll hold a hearing about it if necessary, to bring to us the outstanding, bring to us the superior, rather than just the average. Yeah, we got to take care of the average student, no question. But if you raise the bar for what you can do with superior students, people who can go into the law like you did, Marcus, people who can go into, engineering and different technologies like you guys have. If you can bring students to a superior level, the entire education system will rise up in the process.
Okay. So there's some ideas, I guess. And that's something we need to explore. So I know we don't have much time left. And so I wanted to shoot some questions to you real quickly, kind of quick.
Speed round.
Kind of lightning round.
Kind of lightning round, but nothing too crazy.
Just a bunch of gotcha questions.
So let me ask you this question. Has the U.S. response to the pandemic been good?
No, it hasn't. It is hindsight, though. You got to be a bit careful with hindsight. I don't like blaming people after the fact. However, I'll tell you one thing that I'm really disappointed in. We've got data systems that tell us about every American virtually. We call them electronic medical records. I'm in healthcare. We've got health information exchanges. Why didn't every single governor in this country and or the president suggest that each healthcare information exchange produce a list of people who are vulnerable? We could have done that in the state of Colorado. We got one on the east side, one on the west side, said, look, there's 180,000 people in the state of Colorado who meet the criteria of being over 60 with one or more comorbidities that make them a high risk for coronavirus. Send them a letter, call them on the phone, tell them to stay home for 2 months and let us deal with it the rest of the way. There's lots of things we could have done.
And just didn't do. Fair enough.
Yep.
Next question for you. Should kids be in school right now? Physically in school?
I think they should be. I mean, I think if you're a parent and your child has cystic fibrosis or some other, clinically debilitating disease, you should probably keep your kids home. But the fact of the matter is, under 14 years of age, we just don't see deaths. We hardly ever see symptoms. The bigger question is, do they infect teachers? Contact tracing around the world today, there have not been a provable case of a child giving a teacher the coronavirus. Although if the teachers wear masks, and I would say sophisticated masks and gloves, I think the risk is relatively low. I think people are going to get this. There's going to be infections. Infections aren't the deal. It's how sick do you get? Do you end up in a hospital and do you die? I think there's manageable risks for schools. And I think the risk of being out of schools is much greater than being in schools, but parents should have the option.
All right. Justice Ginsburg passed away.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure you've been asked about this. Should her seat be filled immediately, or should there be the Garland, if you will, precedent invoked? Because it's within 11 months. I don't know. I'm just throwing this out there to you.
I would say the McConnell precedent.
Fair enough.
So I was asked this question earlier today by a reporter, and I'll tell you what I said. I said, 29 times prior to now, justice vacancy occurred on the Supreme Court during an election year. Each of those 29 times, the president nominated somebody. So yes, the president should nominate somebody, just like President Obama did with Merrick Garland. My view on Merrick Garland is he should have had a hearing. He should have had a vote, right? I mean, he should have. I think that it's very likely he would have been voted down because it was a Republican Senate, and today we have a Republican president and a Republican Senate. But my point was, two wrongs don't make a right. If it should happen every time, not doing it this year just because we didn't do it in 16 means we've done it wrong twice in a row. Why would we do that? Yes, does that require Mitch McConnell standing up and saying, yeah, we probably should have had a hearing on Merrick Garland? I'm just telling you my opinion. My opinion is it should have been done in 16. It should be done this time, and it should be done every time because that's what's constitutionally necessary.
Fair enough.
That is fair enough.
All right, a couple more.
No, keep
you
going.
Okay? You okay? See a couple more?
I'm good.
I know you probably, we're going to get off in a second. Should ex-felons who serve their sentence be allowed to vote?
Absolutely. I have one
What
living.
else to say about that?
I have one living in my house, and he asked me this question, Marcus, and I think we all should be asking this question, and that is, he said, did I pay my debt to society?
Boom.
If you paid your debt to society, why would you be restricted from voting? He gets to vote in Colorado. He's going to vote for me. I've convinced him of that. But, it's one of those things that's a very easy answer.
Captive audience.
There you go. Okay. Final question.
Yep.
Do you believe that Russia meddled in the election in 2016, and do you think they're trying to do it again? It's my final one, I promise.
Yeah, I don't know that I have enough evidence. I mean, I guess it's possible that they did. What I don't know is, what did they try to accomplish? Did they try to help Hillary? Did they try to help Trump? I think that Russia and China are serious threats to the United States of America. Mm-hmm. I think we have to be mindful of what happens in elections. So I'm also very, very worried about our ability to secure our data systems. I think if you go into a bank, banks are really, really good at it. Healthcare, we're getting worse. The hackers are getting better at our systems. So is Russia meddling in our election or trying to? Probably. Did they try to meddle in 16? Probably. Will they try to do it in 24? Probably. I think that's just part of what they're trying to do to control what happens in our American system. I think the Chinese probably are as well, and it's dangerous.
Fair enough. Kevin?
Who you got? 2020. Not who do you want to win. Who is going to win? I want to hear your prediction. If you gotta bet $5 or a steak dinner or what have you. I'm not a gambling man, so I'll bet you $1. Who's gonna win?
Steve House beats Jason Crow by 2.5 points.
No, we're not laughing at your chance of winning.
Yeah,
I meant Biden and Trump, sir.
I was like, yeah, okay.
I didn't clarify.
So let's just take it from a data systems guy, right? A data and analytics guy. Incumbents have an advantage, no question about it. Rarely does an incumbent lose. The last time an incumbent lost, there was a third party in the race that was very disruptive. In this particular case, it was Ross Perot, right?
Yeah.
So I think that favors Trump winning. I do think that favors Trump winning. I think it's probably going to be closer than it was last time, but I do think he's probably going to win this.
Okay.
Hope you're wrong.
Ask me after the debates. Ask me after the debates.
Yeah, I know, right?
You know, a friend of mine showed me a voting card the other day that said, you know, like a recommendation on votes, and it said Biden, Hickenlooper, House, and I said, huh, that's interesting, right?
I got to have one more question.
Sure.
Because we're closely connected to all these Democrats out here. I know Jason Crow personally. I was instrumental, or at least I like to think I was instrumental in helping him win. Why do you think you're better than Jason Crow for this position?
We're not talking personality.
Not personalities, policy-wise.
Policy.
Well, I think healthcare is the number one issue of the day. I have a lot more experience in it. I think education is right up there with it. And I think I have, you know, a lot better plan for education. I think immigration follows that. And again, I think we have a lot better plan for immigration. I think the other factor is the voters themselves have to start making better decisions. And I think the better decision is if you take office and you don't accomplish the primary objectives you were hired for, then I don't think you should get a second term. And I think if voters keep operating that way across the country, government will get a lot better. I think, you know, because if in 2 years, if I'm your congressman in 2 years, I haven't done anything about immigration, education, healthcare, and racial injustice, then I shouldn't win. If voters make that happen over and over again, people will do a better job, and we need people to do a better job. Jason's okay. I just don't think he has enough experience behind him to get the primary goals and objectives that you need in CD6 done.
Okay. And with that, I just want to say thank you, Steve, just for quite frankly coming on to the show, answering some questions. We were not here to play the beat you up game. We just really wanted to have some actual conversations on your views and so forth. It's not for us to debate. It's for the public to look at, the public to consider, and the public to make their decisions. And our job is just, quite frankly, just to get some honest answers. So I appreciate you coming on. I can't say thank you enough.
Well, you know what? One of the things we're going to do after I'm elected is we're going to run at least a dozen town halls, you know, in an annual basis, probably double that number, because people like you ought to be able to ask me questions, tough questions. I ought to be able to say to you, I don't know the answer to that. I'll get back to you, but I better get back to you. I think it's one of those things where everybody deserves to be heard when you're their servant. People aren't going to call me Congressman House. They're going to call me Steve because I work for you. And I think if we can go down that path together and give you a voice, this kind of a show is a good starting point. Let's keep doing it.
Fair enough.
There you go. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve House, everyone do your research, go vote. Make sure you're registered, double check, and then go vote. November 3rd.
All right.
You know what I want? I want for my campaign shirt in the next election, if I get there, Kevin, is I want a shirt that says, Houston, we have a few less problems.
Hey,
Fair enough.
All right, guys. Appreciate
Thank you so much,
Thank
Steve.
you, sir.
Have a good night.
Good work on the school board. Keep it up. That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate
All
it.
right. See you guys.
Get the money, back the money.